There we go. Good morning, everybody. Good to have you all here. It's my pleasure to introduce Emily Rhodes this morning. We've been in contact with Emily for pretty much all of the summer, and this is the first time I've seen Emily. Hi, Emily. Good to see you. When we first started planning this summit, and it was going to be in person, well, my wife and I were going to host Emily at our place in Billings, and then we kind of bribed her into saying we're going to take her on a trip to Yellowstone Park too, but that's not happening, at least now. Maybe Emily will come back at some time for a live performance, but and then we'll do that Yellowstone trip. But anyhow, we're very pleased that she is here. Emily provides technical assistance and community planning support at the Just Transition Fund. With a background in urban planning, Emily's work is focused on resilience and land use planning in communities impacted by the transition away from coal. Emily is a native Michigander and holds a BA in anthropology and sociology from Kalamazoo College and a Master of Urban Planning from New York University's Wagner School of Public Policy. She is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, Edward. And yes, we will take a rain check, and I hope to make it out to Montana in the future when we're all able to travel again. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can I, once I start the presentation, just get a verbal confirmation that this is showing?
We can see advancing a just transition in U.S. coal community slide.
Okay, great. Just making sure all my notes aren't showing or anything like that. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you again so much for having me here today. As Edward mentioned, my name is Emily Rhodes. I'm the Technical Assistance and Planning Manager with the Just Transition Fund. I've been with the fund for about 2.5 years now. And while I'm based in Illinois, I work across the country with communities that are impacted by the energy transition. So just a quick roadmap for our time together today. I'm going to start just with a brief context setting of our changing coal economy. I'll then go ahead and introduce the Just Transition Fund and our approach to this work and the work that we do across the country. And then the bulk of my remarks will be around case studies to spark ideas and provide examples of what communities and organizations have been doing to address and advance transition in their communities. So we'll start with one community that's currently working on planning for their transition. I'll highlight an organization that's developed that's developed programs and projects to advance transition on the ground in their region, and then wrap up with a few state examples of places that are working on advancing transition policies at the state level. Then provide a few takeaways and resources, and then as Ed mentioned in the beginning of his remarks, I know we have some time built in for question and for discussion, so I'm looking forward to that. So again, just as some context setting, we're here today talking about a just energy transition, and it's an important topic and something I spend my days working on because, as you know, we are seeing and have been seeing a huge shift in our energy economy. As driven by coal infrastructure aging, we're seeing falling renewable prices, making that a more available source of energy, a fairly flat energy demand, and then concerns over fossil fuel pollution to our health, to our environment, to our land, air, and water. And as you can see, this trend of closures, this transition is going to continue. These charts are from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or AIFA. And they produce a yearly report looking at what is happening within the coal economy, within the energy economy more generally. And they're a great resource with a wealth of knowledge and reports and information that I definitely recommend tapping into. And so while this transition brings benefits, again, to the environment, to our public health, we know that the communities that host these places host these coal assets, they must grapple with what the resulting economic impacts and social impacts are to these closures. And at JTF, we talk about those things as different layers of distress. So the impact on direct and indirect jobs and that ripple effect throughout the economy. The erosion of the tax base. Often these assets are large providers of taxes to multiple taxing districts, from the counties to the school districts, to parks departments. The impact on the land and how and when that remediation will take place, and then what that site can be reused for, and thinking through the diversification of an economy. So these are all part of this changing coal economy. So the JTF, we work in those places that are experiencing those ripple effects and are experiencing those layers of distress. So with our partners on the ground, we work to advance solutions that are equitable, inclusive, and low carbon. And we do this through two main ways. So our approach is a hybrid model. So on the one side, we have our grant making work. So we make direct investments to 501c3 organizations that are working to advance economic development solutions, workforce development, who are advancing planning processes on the ground to talk about what comes next, or who are addressing policies to advance transition, predominantly at the state level. On the other arm, we have our technical assistance work, and that's where I sit. Some of you also may have met my colleague, Cindy Winland, who I know had done some work in Montana a few years back. But her and I, we work as independent partners, helping to convene stakeholders, bring conversations together to plan for what comes next after a coal mine is closed, and how to think about building on assets and diversifying the economy there. And this work is complementary. So things that we learn on the ground through our technical assistance work helps us with directing our direct investments. Things that we learn from our nonprofit partners that we're providing funding to helps inform the work that we're doing on the ground. So these really, these two programs are intentional and fit well together. Because I am part of the Just Transition, or I'm sorry, because I am part of the technical assistance side, just to give you an idea of how that process runs on the ground with communities. It typically starts by helping to set up a leadership team of some sort, a task force or a steering committee, to really help drive that transition planning process forward. So we'll talk a lot about the importance of early planning, or at least starting to plan now, starting these conversations, because we know that building these partnerships and relationships outside a time of crisis, at this time when you can have more mature partnerships, can often lead to better outcomes. We then often work with our community partners to conduct outreach to different affected stakeholders. We know that this transition impacts a variety of different stakeholders and residents and business owners differently. And so we help to set up community meetings. We go attend other meetings, conduct surveys to get information, hear the stories of those who are impacted on the ground, because we know that the solutions and the recommendations that come from these planning process must be based on that local context and by those who are most impacted. We also then, a large component of our work on these next two bullet points is identifying sources of funding. So a lot of times we'll get the question of, where does funding come from for this work? And often I think about these funding opportunities as a layered cake. I heard this in a webinar a while back, but there's not going to be one funding source that is going to fund your entire transition. It's a long process. There's a lot of different components, different things that go into the planning process, and implementation, starting programs or projects. And so really thinking about these different layers of funding and that align with your goals and align with where you might be at in your particular stage of transition. And then finally on the ground, helping to create these action plans to write down what are the impacts that we're seeing from the tax base to the workforce to the social fabric. What are the opportunities or resources that can be leveraged to move the transition forward? And thinking about this from a long-term perspective. There's really no start or end point to these transitions, but thinking, what does the next generation need? How are we retaining population, attracting new population, whatever the goals of the community may be. And then the last bullet there is really throughout the process, things like what we do today too, but I believe so strongly in networks and information sharing and resource sharing. So a lot of our work is providing information and case studies, as I'll be doing today, about what's happening in other places where folks have seen things work, or they might have seen things not work, or what they would potentially do differently. Because the JTF is never here to swoop in and provide solutions or say what a place must do, but they're to provide information, to learn from what is happening across the country, that then local communities can take and apply to their particular context. And so before I jump into the case studies, just one note about what we mean by a just transition. We know, this term is used often. And so when we think about a just transition, we really think about the strengthening and diversifying of local economies. So this might look like reducing the dependence on mono economies, and looking at creating jobs in diverse or growing sectors. That can look like both place-based or remote work opportunities, but really focusing on that idea of building local wealth, and having it driven by those who are most impacted. This looks like building resilience of the workforce. So a lot of times when we're working in communities, a lot of our partners are looking at opportunities to provide wraparound or supportive services. So things like childcare can be a barrier to getting jobs, resume building, interview skills, thinking about all these different wraparound services that can help build the resilience of a workforce. In addition to that, taking into account the future of work. So, preparing folks for jobs that for the 21st century in growing industries, things that will be here. It looks like accelerating and developing low carbon solutions. We know that to address climate change, we cannot continue to invest in high carbon activities. And in addition, the clean energy sector is a key component to economic diversification and has large potential for economic development. And then finally, strengthening the field. So this can look like moving state policy forward, as I'll talk about in a little bit, and encouraging national action around transition. JTF and a lot of our colleagues, some might be on this call, have been doing this work through the National Economic Transition Platform. So looking at what can be happening at the federal level. We know, there's work being done through the interagency working group. We've seen historic levels of funding available to coal communities. So really, what are these things that can strengthen the field? And finally, just recognizing that context matters. While there are things that we can learn from one another, from other places, really thinking about what are those assets and resources on the ground, knowing that solutions will vary from place to place, and that these are complex challenges. And so transitioning will require more than one strategy or solution or sector or player. We have a grantee that says there may not be a single silver bullet, but there could be 1,000 silver BBs. And I just love that, that analogy to just think through what are all the different ways that people might be entering the conversation, and all the different types of projects, program solutions that will help move a transition forward. So now I'm going to dive into a couple of case studies. These are organized in two ways. One, we'll start out east and head west. And then also, as I mentioned in our roadmap, we'll start with a case study around communities that are starting to plan for the transition, organizations that are implementing programs and projects, and then end with a few state policies that we see happening at the state level. So first up, Greene County, Pennsylvania. Greene County is in the southwest most corner of Pennsylvania, bordering West Virginia. So really in that Appalachian corridor there. And since the 1980s, they have been the largest producer of coal in the state of PA. But in recent years, as we know is happening across the country, coal production has declined. Thus, employment in the industry has declined. And in the most recent census, they're also seeing general population decline. So between 2010 and 2020, they saw about 7% decrease in their population. So we're working with a steering committee based in Greene County, the Greene County Economic Diversification Steering Committee. We were brought in by one of our grantee partners to say, you know, I think a lot of folks are looking forward, looking at this transition and wanting to plan and think through what are our opportunities to address the declines that we're seeing, leverage our assets, and look towards economic diversification and growth. So we have a steering committee that meets bi-weekly of about 20 local leaders. And we have the county commissioner on board, an economic justice nonprofit, faith-based organizations, workers, the school district superintendent, representatives from the local hospital healthcare system, the local United Way sits on the steering committee, small business owners, local financial institutions, local vocational technical colleges, the library. I'm throwing these out because often when we think about setting up these leadership teams, we're looking at who are the impacted stakeholders, who has access to resources to help advance the conversation, the time to sit on these steering committees and do the work. And so just wanted to give kind of an outline of some of the types of stakeholders that we often tap into and make sure that we have there at the table. Labor, yeah, I think I mentioned workers. So it's a diverse set of folks who come together to talk about, one, the impacts that they're seeing. So where are closures happening? Where are those workers living? What's happening around the general population, tracking those demographic and population trends, and then thinking about what the assets and resources that they have on the ground as they're creating their vision for what they would like to see in the future, and identifying how to build on those community assets to craft their action plan. So we're currently at the point of conducting a series of outreach in the community when we're thinking about engagement, thinking about all the different points that people might be able to engage into this. So you'll see here we have a flyer, we have a survey that's running right now. We have over 200 entries so far from residents identifying what they see as the greatest challenges, what they see as the greatest opportunities within their community. We are going to county fairs, going to different festivals, going to other groups' meetings to talk about this work and to really get a community conversation going. And they're at the early stage of their planning process. So we'll be putting together this action plan. At the same time, they're also looking at applying for federal funding for some job creation opportunities in the community. And they were just recently awarded the Appalachian Regional Commission, or ARC, grant to expand broadband in their area. So, you know, I think they're a great example of, we're working on the planning process, they're applying for grants in that time, and really thinking holistically about how to take advantage of the opportunities that are currently available and chart this path forward for their community. Next, I want to highlight Rural Action. They are a regional community development organization that covers a 21 county footprint in Appalachian, Ohio. So they're in Southwest Ohio, and they really look at building the region's economy from an asset base, from an asset development and wealth creation standpoint. So one of their programs is their Sustainable Energy Solutions program, and they've been looking to advance their energy leadership. So you know, they have a strong coal history, and so they're working to advance their energy leadership by focusing on energy efficiency and growing the deployment of renewables in Southwest Ohio. So over the last about 3 years, they've been providing solar training through a solar certification program that includes both online coursework as well as on the ground installation training. So they're really growing the expertise of the workforce in the area. And then on the other side, they're also looking to grow and bring utility scale solar to those places where coal plants have been and are closing in Southwest Ohio. So really thinking about kind of both sides of this work. And earlier this year, they did get based on approval for a 400 megawatt installation, I believe, in Southwest Ohio. Still working on are there opportunities to bring that associated manufacturing to the area. But again, this nonprofit really looking holistically at the work. And well, I want to highlight their Sustainable Energy Solutions program. They are also just a great organization to look into, as they are really working on a number of different program areas. They work on building social enterprises. So in addition to this work on sustainable energy, they're doing some really cool and innovative work around creating businesses to support the environment, like producing pigments, taking the pigments from acid mine drainage, which I can paint, if I understand the business model correctly, and then also building wealth in their communities. So they started a business, a produce auction, to help connect local farmers to larger markets so they could sell their livestock, their produce wholesale. So again, just this example of thinking through these multiple solutions, thinking holistically about how they're creating thriving communities in their target Southwest Ohio region. So I'm gonna move a little bit further west and pivot to starting to highlight some legislation that has passed recently in different states. So looking at states that are addressing this energy transition. And while I'll be talking about and focusing on these state level policies, just knowing that a lot of this is happening, and a lot of the legislation that we're seeing at the state level has been led by advocacy, local advocacy on the ground, and partnerships that local nonprofits, local city managers and county commissioners have said, you know, this is impacting us, this is impacting our communities, our region, and then building those partnerships with their legislators to make these grants or this legislation or these offices a reality. So in Minnesota, they have two opportunities there that the state was looking at to address transition more broadly. So last year, they created their community energy transition grants. And this was really to assist communities in addressing the economic dislocation of the closure of electric generating plants. And the total amount of this program was $2 million. And I always like to talk about, when possible, where things are funded, because again, that does come up often. And so this $2 million program was funded through a renewable development account. So grantees had to be in Xcel Energy territory, one of the utilities in Minnesota, because the funding came from this renewable development account, which Xcel pays into. It's a fee they pay into to store their nuclear waste. And the program was run through the Minnesota Department of Employment and, I have it on my slide, Employment and Economic Development, DEED. And so they were looking for projects and partnerships that were existing already to provide a max of $500,000 grants. And this could be used for assisting workers in retraining. It could be used for projects that would create or enhance their tax base, as well as just general strategies that relate to economic development. And so I just want to pause one thing to pull out and note about that, going back to this importance of that local planning, identifying your projects. When funding opportunities become available, you know, it's really never too early to start planning, to start thinking about what those projects look like, so that when funding becomes available, groups are ready to take advantage of those. So last year, they did make 5 awards. 2 of the awards were for water and sewer related projects for business expansion. One was to do some of the environmental work necessary to get a site ready for remediation and redevelopment. And then 2 were related more to planning. So understanding a specific site, what could happen post-closure, thinking again about the community context, the timeline. And while this was a one-time program, it did launch after this one-time grant program. The legislature did pass additional legislation to create their energy transition office. And so this just passed earlier this year. They're still in the early stages of setting up the office. I think they currently have a job description out looking for a director for this office. But we have been working with a 13 agency, what they call the Minnesota Business Vitality Council, to do some background research, some peer learning. We've brought in folks from the state of New York, from the state of Colorado, which I'll talk about in a little bit, again, all virtually, communities in Illinois, again, trying to set up this kind of opportunity for peer learning or learning what other communities are doing across the country. And so that Business Vitality Council has put together a report that will then go to help inform and advance the work that the Energy Transition Office is doing. Also just highlighting the structure of these, because often in places that might be looking to replicate this or figuring out how to set up, I would say we often see kind of this advisory committee structure being put into place. And that is also what Minnesota is using. So the advisory structure will include local residents from host communities that host large baseload generating plants, representatives of labor, representatives from nonprofit organizations that work on clean energy and energy efficiency. So helping to make sure that, you know, it's not just another siloed office, but that it's being informed by the work happening on the ground. And then next, just a bit about the office, the Colorado Office of Just Transition. I think often folks lift this up as, you know, there was one of the first state offices to be created. And so just the context in Colorado is they have 7 remaining coal-fired power plants, 6 mines, and most of which those mines serve the local power plants or plants in contiguous states. And the state also has aggressive strategy for decarbonization, same with Minnesota. But in, I think it was 3 years ago, the governor announced a vision for 100% renewable energy in the electric sector by 2040. And so it was really this legislation and really labor who said, you know, if we're going to make this a reality, we need to plan for this and think about what those impacts are going to be. And so they also set up an advisory committee structure that helped to inform this plan. So this was actually put into legislation in 2019, the creation of both the Office of Just Transition and establishing the advisory committee that was made up of stakeholders, utilities, labor, community representatives, again, to help create first a draft plan that was then open for public comment and review, and then their final Just Transition action plan. And I would encourage folks to go look at it online. If you haven't, it's quite well done. It lays out a set of 13 strategies for communities, workers, and funding support, and really sets the path for the office going forward, because the advisory committee's mandate was to take a holistic approach to create this plan, looking at the different host communities, the impacts that they would face, and then, you know, assisting those workers and those communities in their planning. And one thing that you know, I always really appreciate about listening to and hearing from the Colorado Office of Just Transition is really thinking about that goal of not setting up another structure or another agency to be siloed, but to really, again, thinking about the complexity of this work, being that connector, coordinating among different state agencies, so that you know, communities and the workforce who are being impacted by this aren't, you know, hopping from economic development to workforce development, but really kind of coordinating across and bringing focus to those resources in the name of supporting the communities in transition. And then the last case study, and I'm going to give a caveat. I know it's in some of my early conversations with Edward, he mentioned the Centralia, Washington. I haven't worked on on this particularly. So I pulled some information that I was able to find, but also the Ohio River Valley Institute, which is an organization that's done a lot of great work and reports around transition. I think they've highlighted some work in Greene County as well. They have a report pulling information about Centralia, some of the outcomes of the work that was happening there. So would also direct folks to that. I can drop it in the link after the presentation, or drop the link in the chat after the presentation. But in 2011, TransAlta, the owner of the plant, under a settlement agreement with the state of Washington to phase out coal at Centralia by 2025. And this part of this this agreement was for TransAlta to provide $55 million over 10 years in transition funding for economic development, energy investment, to the impacted community. So I think they organized 3 funds: weatherization, community and economic development, and energy technology funding. What I've highlighted here is some of the workforce work. So this was taken from one of their applications, but they were providing funding support to programs and to organizations that were creating programs and projects that benefit displaced workers. And so one of the interesting things about the Ohio River Valley Institute report too was being able to have that that time frame that they were able to look back and say these grants are being distributed. I think starting in 2016. And so, that's one of the interesting things about the transition work, is that a lot of people are right in the midst of it right now. And so to pull out best practices, it's great to have those timeframes to be able to do that from. So the report looked at the grants dispersed between 2016 and 2019 and found that during that same period, the community saw wage growth, they saw job creation, they saw population growth. And so again, the context is important, and you have to think about the particular specific context, but again, in the name of case studies, providing good lessons learned and things to consider, this is a good one. And then, not a case study, but I did just want to take a moment to talk about the federal government's role in this. So right now, we're seeing historic levels of funding and work at the federal level to coordinate across agencies to support coal communities. So the Interagency Working Group, which is, I believe, coordinated across 12 state agencies to help kind of focus and funding and direct resources specifically to coal communities, has been going on listening tours around different places in the country. And we're also seeing these historic levels of funding, such as the EDA, the Economic Development Administration's coal community commitment. And so this is a series of funding for all 6 of these notice of funding opportunities. Coal communities are eligible to apply. However, it was key that they pulled out and set aside $300 million to go to their coal communities commitment. And I did list the definition of what the EDA defines as their coal communities, because it's fairly broad. And so, that I think that offers a lot of opportunities for different places to say, yes, that we are impacted by this transition, and have the opportunity to think about how they could leverage these resources. Because up to this point, we know that states and often individual communities have really largely been grappling with the transition and trying to figure out how to replace their tax base, how to support direct and indirect workforce being impacted, how to remediate and reuse the land. And so having this focused funding has the opportunity to be transformational. But I do want to just draw folks' attention to the bottom of the slide, because we know there are still challenges to accessing these federal funds. It's time intensive, it's resource and capacity intensive for places to apply. And so on our website, actually probably as we're speaking, there should be a blog post going up. We have had 2 workshops. One was of these funding opportunities, how to pick or think about what the right opportunity might be for your community. Again, thinking about your community goals and vision, and what aligns with these different opportunities and what it actually means to apply for them. And then last week we had another webinar looking at how to write a strong EDA proposal. So just kind of providing insights and information to, as you're writing the proposal, what are some things to keep in mind, what EDA will often look for. So those 2 recordings are available. And in addition to that, we're also providing limited one-on-one support. So helping through the grant review process, and there on that blog post, there will be a link that you can provide your information if you're interested in that type of support. And then we'll also be providing, sending out an RFP, because again, we know that it can be resource intensive to apply for these grants, to do that planning work, to get those different studies that might be necessary. So that funding will also be available to help support that work. Okay, we're in the home stretch. So I really just want to wrap up by bringing kind of all the different points that I've been talking about through these case studies, through how JTF approaches this work, onto my 4 main takeaways from the work that we're doing. So 1, thinking about the importance of planning and starting now. As I mentioned before, really believing that it's never too early to start thinking about what will these impacts be, how can you build partnerships and grow conversations in your community, in your region. I have a lot more case studies, a lot more information to share. You know, we're working with our Midwestern Governors Association, which is a coalition of 12 states, to really start talking about, you know, this planning, to get these conversations going, to share these resources. So really thinking about starting these conversations now. This summit is great work. I know a lot of work has been done prior to this. Focusing on diversification. So in a lot of places where we're working, you know, it's not going to be a single industry that is going to replace the tax base or the work, you know, the workforce. And so really thinking about what are all those different avenues, all those different growing sectors and opportunities to build on your local assets, and thinking about this from a diversification standpoint. Planning for the long term is crucial, and when thinking about programs and policies, thinking about opportunities for that long-term support. This planning, it takes a long time. Economic diversification takes a long time. I think it was actually one of our speakers in our Midwestern Governors Association said, it takes a really long time for economic development to happen quickly. And I thought that was a great way to phrase it, that again, there's a lot of partnership building and background work that needs to happen in order to see that new business, to see that new streetscape, to implement that workforce program. And so the support, you know, as folks are thinking about different levels of support that could be available for this type of community, having that long-term support, having things that we're seeing at the federal level is crucial. And then finally, building inclusive networks and learning from others. So, you know, this really, the transition should be driven by those who are most impacted from the ground up. And so I believe so strongly in networks and learning from one another, that conversations between peers in other places, they can be such powerful messengers, both to share lessons learned, but to help to keep that momentum going at the local level, to say, you know, you're not alone. Other places are thinking about this, and, you know, to support one another through the transition. So I want to say thank you. There's many more resources on our website. We have our blueprint for Just Transition. So just a couple of the aspects in that. We have a document, Build Your Plan. So if you or someone you know are just really at the early stages of thinking through, how do we get started? How are we building our leadership team or organizing our process? That is a great resource. We have information about different policies that impact coal communities. And then finally, we have even more case studies on the website. And I don't think I covered any of the case studies that are also on our website. So, there's additional wealth of information there to learn from what other places are doing. So with that,
Excellent.
I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, Emily. Well, we thank you so much. We've got some questions, and that I'll read off. And from Marianne, we have: what is your suggestion to help coal communities and union workers with retirement replacement, mortgage, and mortgage supplementation? These folks powered Montana and the U.S. for a century, and now it's time to move on, and we want to bring them along with us to benefit.
Yeah, so that is a great question and goes back to this funding question. So we've seen different workforce development programs that have sought to address that wage gap from a variety of different levels. So one, both that, thinking about retirement, and it's not just the retirement benefits, but health benefits, pension, other, I guess that's retirement. But so I would say, I think a lot of this is building that. Is there an opportunity to build that at the state or the national level? I actually have a sheet that that highlights different workforce programs that I can probably send along. But in different places, actually, Canada had a pretty large program that provided different levels of support. So one was wage differential replacement. So often when you're talking about workers who are earlier in their career, if you're thinking about retraining or moving to another industry, often there is a large wage gap in whatever industry they may be moving towards. So are there programs that can provide support to bridge that gap? And same with retirement, or at least a bridge to retirement. So I guess, thinking about what are those opportunities to build in flexibility to those programs, because just as I've been talking about kind of at the community level, context matters. We know that workers are at different point in their career. They're at different, have different levels of interest in, where they might want to move next. So with any sort of training program, wage replacement, bridge to retirement, thinking about how to build in that flexibility. But there's been some research that I think the price tag of some of those things is high. And so thinking about what are opportunities at the state or federal level.
Great. Also have a question on from someone who said, sorry if I already missed this, but with some of the rural economic development organizations, what is their business designation? Are they CDFIs? Are they 501c3s? Just curious about how their structure allows them to access different types of support, such as government grants that go to specific entities, et cetera.
Yeah, so at least from JTF standpoint, so we fund 501c3 organizations, are the designation for the nonprofit organizations, or for the organizations that we fund. We also have partnered with CDFIs. There's some great CDFIs in Appalachia doing great work around housing affordability and building businesses. But most of our partners are 501c3s. I will say from the federal level though, each notice of funding opportunity will identify who is or is not eligible. And so for some of them, like the like the Build Back Better grant or the Economic Adjustment Assistance grant, Build Back Better is a challenge. Economic Adjustment Assistance is a grant program. So they're structured slightly different, but they'll list which entities are eligible or not. But I would say it's most different entities and structures are, I believe for Build Back Better, it's probably easier to talk about who's not, which is like private companies and maybe individuals. But it's, yeah, I would say check the notice of funding opportunity for federal opportunities.
Okay, great. Hearing from Marianne again, I'm a Montana state legislator, and our legislature still is in denial with the need for energy transition. What do you recommend as far as legislation and policy for ruby red states like ours?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I would say is if you, I'm for any of the case studies that I highlighted, or maybe with the exception of Centralia, I don't know anyone in Washington, but or beyond, please feel free to reach out to me. And if they're, I think a lot about the messenger for talking about this work. And so, if there is learnings, or if there would be interest in connecting with other state legislatures who are thinking about this legislation, thinking about this work, we've talked to legislators in Pennsylvania and Virginia, in Illinois, and I know these are a lot of not ruby red states, but if there, I think, can be lessons learned or ways that other legislators may have thought about kind of overcoming particular hurdles, thinking about building on different policies. Maybe some of these they might be at the office level, at the level of creating an office, but there may be things that those legislators did prior to build up towards getting things like an office of energy transition passed in places where maybe a few years ago that wasn't feasible.
Okay, great. From Larry, we have a question. How is it that a plan for the full life cycle, like a cradle to grave type cycle, was never considered, presumably by these businesses, utilities and whatnot? Since this seems another example of the cost of business that has been passed on to others. Do the businesses that cause the problems ever put any money into this issue?
So, I think one of my responses to that is going back to kind of currently what we're seeing at the federal level. There's other countries, other places that have, like Canada has a national plan to phase out coal and hold different companies responsible and plan for it. Germany has a national plan that's written in legislation to phase out coal. And I think, often, or there's no kind of overarching rule in the country, or even in different states to say, this is what a particular utility or power provider or company in general has to do previously. I think we are seeing more companies starting to take on that responsibility. So things like the Centralia example, again, I know that was a settlement fund, but that company was paying towards that. We one of our other engagements right now is down in Texas. We have the utility on our task force steering committee leadership team, and they have, so I think there is a kind of a changing attitude, but yeah, that's, sorry, as you can see, I'm kind of like stumbling through this because I don't have a good answer that other than I think having these conversations, talking, to companies, working to work through this transition together is a key component of the work going forward.
Well, in the case of utilities, it seems like they're regulated, and that could be something that could be stipulated by different states, perhaps, in certain cases.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's correct. You know, and again, to highlight Minnesota again, they are regulated, and you know, we can talk about that term too. But you know, so there are different requirements that those utilities are held to, and we hear that a lot actually in our Midwestern Governors Association working groups. Is that, you know, we lift up the work in Minnesota often, but again, recognizing that the context is different, that the state regulations of you know what actors are required to do, it definitely varies from place to place.
Well, speaking of Minnesota, our next question from John is, in the Minnesota case study, what energy source are they transitioning from?
So coal, and they have a nuclear plant, or 2 nuclear plants. So Minnesota's interesting. They another thing that they have done is they have what they call the coalition of utility cities, and so I believe it's 8 between coal plant and nuclear baseload generating baseload generating plants, and those communities, you know, they have worked together to advocate for changing legislation for getting support into their communities. So yeah, with coal and nuclear.
Great. Got lots of great questions from Marianne. She also wants to know, can you please tell me how coal communities, especially Colstrip in Montana, access these federal funds, especially with all the state barriers? So they have a local economic development entity, but is it state, or how does that happen?
So you mean in terms of like the grant writing process, or so I mean the again, the eligibility for some of the funding opportunities, in particular with the current notice of funding opportunities that I had up on the slide. You know, while you need to align with the community economic development, SEDS is the comprehensive economic development strategy. So you need to align with, you know, the like broader regional plans. Communities are able to apply for those fundings. I believe nonprofits are also able. You'll need a lead applicant, but you know that we're seeing that in Southwest Pennsylvania, that it is the again, I believe the 501c3 will be the lead applicant to apply for that federal funding to get resources to rehabilitate a building into kind of an incubator space, workforce development hub. In East Texas, where it's the Council of Governments that are coming together to apply for the funding. So, and I'm not sure if I'm answering this question appropriately, but JTF is also helping different kind of structures of partnerships through that proposal process.
I mean, I think the part of the question I'm guessing is like, do folks in Colstrip know about these grants? If so, who's telling them about them, the opportunities, and yeah, how do they start to engage and take advantage of them?
Yeah, and so you know, it's a good question about like getting this information out. It's one of the things that we're trying to do. I assume a lot of the partners on the site or on the webinar may talk about this as well. But I think, you know, connecting with organizations, again, like the JTF, like Northern Plains Resource Council, like others who, you know, maybe looking at how to bring these resources into communities is a good place to start to learn about these and to talk through, you know, what this could look like, for example, for Colstrip to apply. I will say, you know, the deadlines for some of these are coming up quickly. And so again, thinking about what are the opportunities to start these conversations, to start the planning now. There will be more resources down the line as well. So, you know, even if we're just starting in the conversations at this point, you know, at least getting that suite of projects that you think are fundable, starting to gather different letters of recommendation, or putting, you know, making sure you have the right structure to apply, that can all be happening now.
Well, our next question maybe is pretty related. From Branya is wondering, have you worked with communities that aren't receptive, or at least initially receptive, to transitioning to clean energy jobs or infrastructure as a just transition tactic? So maybe a little denial. If so, how has that been navigated?
Yeah, so you know, JTF, we work in places that we're invited in, and so in some of my outreach, or you know, we're calling different places to learn about what is happening with their transition. There have been places that are not ready to have these conversations, even if it's not framed as a just transition, but just, you know, that the coal plant or mine may be closing and going away. I think I've experienced less of that in recent years. I think there has been just the huge mass of announced closures, the additional attention that is being placed on energy transition, again, at the federal level, at different state levels. I think I've been seeing less denial, but it's definitely something that that I've experienced. But I do think that there is usually there's usually some key players who see this happening, who see how this will impact their tax base. You know, school districts are often a good place to start thinking about, you know, taking a look at the budget and how much is the coal plant, you know, contributing to that. I think that can be eye-opening in some places. As I mentioned, we're working with some folks in Texas, and the plant contributes 75% of their revenue based on those taxes. So I think there's still opportunities to think through, you know, if plants were to close, you know, what would that, you know, who would be impacted, starting the conversations there, but those take time. And so there are places that we haven't worked because there's, you know, that conversation isn't happening yet.
Another question from someone who's been in state government. Dan wants to know, to follow up on Mary Ann's first question, which was about pension and
wage replacement.
Yep.
Yeah.
Couldn't there be a sharper focus on guaranteeing retirement benefits for coal workers proportionate to their working years? For example, when coal companies go bankrupt, pension funds are often endangered. The fear of the loss of pension benefits by coal workers is real and significant, and is a major source of political opposition in some states to taking action on climate change. Would it really be that costly to simply have an ironclad guarantee of pension benefits for workers whose jobs will end because of the adjustments that society needs to make to address climate change?
Yeah, I haven't specifically worked in that, but I think maybe someone from Union of Concerned Scientists will be on later to talk about nuclear, but I know some of our partners over at Union of Concerned Scientists, and I can't remember who they partnered with, but just also released a report this past summer, maybe just a few weeks ago, looking at what those costs would be. So that's something that I can look into and pass along.
Sure. Yeah. No easy answers to a lot of these questions.
I was going to say, I know I don't want to let folks down, but I mean, these are all questions that, yeah, we get often and think about every day, and there are no easy kind of quick answers.
Yeah, transition is hard. Well, looks like we're out of time with our questions. I want to thank everyone who did offer questions. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get to them all. So we are going to move on to the next portion of our agenda. But before I do, I just wanted to say thank you to Emily Rhodes for her excellent presentation remarks, and do take her up on her offer to be a resource with her last slide, the information she provided. So thank you, Emily.